Recording started.
Thank you all for joining us. We'll begin shortly, a few more minutes. As you can see on the screen, we are recording the meeting for this presentation. Everybody's going to be muted, and you'll have a chance to give us your questions in the Q&A panel right in the bottom of your screen there. We'll begin really soon. Thank you. Well, hello, good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started on today's Summer Sustainability Series presentation. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Manuel Medrano. I'm the Environmental Services Manager for the City of Chula Vista. Today we have a great interactive, fun way for you to learn about composting and its best uses. Organic waste will be a topic of a lot of interest in the coming years. And why? It's because in the effort to curb the harmful greenhouse gases produced by organic waste decaying in landfills, which, by the way, is about 20% of all greenhouse gases produced in California, the state will require all cities and all counties to have waste collection programs, organic waste collection programs in place to divert these very organics out of the landfill by January 1st, 2022. So besides yard and garden waste, we will also have to include solutions for all food waste generated at homes and businesses in the state. So in Chula Vista, we are planning for this change, and we will require extensive education. I hope you all online could help us educate your friends, neighbors, and family members here in Chula Vista. And yes, it will include an increase in waste collection fees, because now this material is not just being buried, it now has to be managed. So our plan for Chula Vista is to for residents to be able to place their food waste in their yard waste carts. And all these organics will be then composted and offered to users like the agriculture industry and for grounds and fields maintenance. And it can even be digested potentially to create gas. So this presentation will touch a little bit on organics management. Again, if you want to still compost after this presentation, you still could do so. Even when we have that new program, it doesn't mean that you will be required to put all organics in a container, your green container. You could still compost at home, create great compost for your yard and for your plants. But unfortunately, as you'll learn, there's stuff that you just can't compost at home, like meats and bones and stuff like that, and that would still have to go into your green waste cart so it gets composted. So without further ado, let me introduce today's great presenters, and we'll start with Catherine Matthews. Catherine was born and raised in Chula Vista, and as a child, she used to visit the Living Coast Discovery Center. Back then, it used to be called the Chula Vista Nature Center, and I remember that because I used to go there myself as a child. And when she was in grade school, she used to visit this place, just like a lot of us did who grew up in Chula Vista. While earning her bachelor's degree in environmental studies and sustainability at San Diego State, go Aztecs, fellow Aztec here, she interned on a small-scale farm in Benita, and then went to Costa Rica, which sparked her interest and passion for composting and soil conservation. Catherine has been with then she later was hired on at the Living Coast Discovery Center. She's been there since 2011 in many roles, and now she's currently the Facilities and Sustainability Manager. And then followed by David DiDonato. So David Donato was born and raised in just east of Seattle, Washington. In the early days of composting, um, was dumping the fresh grass cut out of the gooey, smelly pile in his backyard. So he's been composting all his life. While working at the also working at the Chula Vista Nature Center, he was part of the original team that began the city's backyard composting program. In 2010, he transitioned over to his current position with the Environmental Services section as a sustainability specialist, and now currently manages the composting program for the city. So thank you very much. And go ahead, Catherine. Go ahead, Catherine.
All right. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I was having a little technical difficulties there. Dave, did you want to start actually, or do you want me to go ahead?
I think Manuel did a good introduction, so go ahead and do the what we're going to cover.
Okay. So we'll move forward with the slides here. If you want to go ahead and go to, I guess I can talk a little bit more about the Living Coast Discovery Center. We are a Dune Aquarium located on the Sweetwater Marsh National Wildlife Refuge, and we've been serving the community of San Diego for over 30 years. If you're in our mission is to inspire the community to connect with and care for our coastal environment. So on a typical visit to the Living Coast, you can meet our green sea turtles, visit our shark and rays, meet some reptiles and some birds of prey up close. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been closed to the public since March, but we've found some innovative ways connected with our community. We started some virtual programs, so there will be virtual field trips available. We also have animal encounters and birthday parties, as well as our compost workshops are now going virtual twice a month. We can also provide private 2-hour tours on site where you get the whole place to yourself, but you can visit our website, thelivingcoast.org, for more information. Our compost workshops are being held via Zoom now on the first and third Sunday of the month at 2 p.m. Chula Vista residents who attend workshops with me can purchase discounted compost bins from the city of Chula Vista. And we also host the Master Composter training course twice a year. But Dave and I are currently developing a virtual format to provide that course to you. So stay tuned for that. So before I get into what we'll cover today, we just want to do our first poll question to get a feel for our audience. And that's going to be, do you know how to compost already? Just take a couple seconds here to answer that for us before we get started. All right. So, see our results here. About a little over half of you don't know how to compost already, and 4 of you do. So hopefully today you will get your just quick overview of composting and some of the different methods, so you can really figure out which one will work best for your household. So in this presentation, we're going to review all the benefits of using compost and why composting is so important, like Manuel was saying earlier. We will also go over the different types of composting, so you can find the method that works best for you. There's some methods that take more effort, a little more time, and then there's others that take very little time whatsoever. And then finally, we'll also go over how to use that compost and how to make compost tea and use that in your garden. So Dave, can you tell us a little bit about what composting is?
Yes, I sure can. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for attending this. I am privileged to be part of Manuel's team that manages the city's trash recycling and household hazardous waste program. And I am also privileged to work with Catherine at the Living Coast Discovery Center. So, so what is composting? Well, decomposition is done by we call it the FBI, the fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates or insects. So in nature, conditions aren't always the best for decomposition and tend to happen over long periods of time, like months, years, decades, even centuries. So composting is this controlled decomposition where we are managing and providing the optimum conditions or parameters for the FBI to do what they do. So why should we compost? Well, Manuel alluded to that, but I give two reasons. First of all, to reduce what you're sending to the landfill. And secondly, you want to be able to improve your soil, right? You have the resources there. Let's improve our soil. So San Diego County has poor soils. Either it's very clay-like and you get a lot of runoff, or it's very sandy soil and it doesn't really hold the water that well. So these yard waste and food waste are resources that we can use instead of discarding them. And we can use them to provide this amendment for our soils. So why do it in your backyard? Well, it's right there. It's easy to do. I have a saying that compost happens. You may not turn it every week or pay attention to it as much as other people, but you don't have to. It might take a little longer, but compost happens still. In your backyard, the contaminants, you don't have to worry about contaminants getting in there. No glass, no plastic, no cigarette butts from other participants that it's collected out when it's collected out in the city. It's inexpensive, right? Again, these resources, your yard waste and your vegetative food waste, you have them. You make this compost, and it will help you to reduce or eliminate the purchase of synthetic fertilizers and even bagged compost too. And also, as Manuel mentioned earlier, you're going to reduce your greenhouse gases, right? It's your own little way of helping save the planet. So thank you for that. So now, what method should you use? And now there are many different methods of composting, and the one that you use will depend on pretty much how much space you have, what type of materials you have, and how much effort you want to put into it. And we'll be discussing those further. But simply put, it's take food, put it in a pile, make soil. Next slide, please. So what are the benefits of using compost? Well, some of you may know all or part of these, but of course, it's going to improve the physical structure of the soil itself, as well as improving the health of the plant. So in clay soils, compost creates these pockets that improve the movement of air and allows and water, and allows greater absorption of the water that reduces the runoff. So there won't be as much runoff. In sandy soils, that compost holds on to the moisture to improve the retention of that water. And then in all soils, compost is going to increase the biodiversity and create a community of living organisms that contribute to a healthy living soil. Compost releases its nutrients slowly to support a stronger, healthier plant. And with a healthier plant, it is more resistant to pests and disease. So just remember, you improve the soil, You improve the health of the plant, you improve the health of the people. Additionally, there's research that has been done to confirm the carbon sequestration ability of compost application. So you improve the soil conditions, and that will allow longer roots, longer plant roots, which store carbon deep in the soil. And that's what we want. That's what needs to happen. As I mentioned before, there are many different composting methods. Let's start with the traditional composting method. This method is used by most commercial composting operations. Catherine, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So traditional or hot composting, as it's otherwise known as, creates the optimal conditions for microorganisms to work in the most efficient manner. So this often coincides with a faster rate of decomposition. What makes a pile so hot, you might ask? Well, this method focuses on the use of what we call aerobic bacteria, which require oxygen, and they produce energy and emit heat. This bacteria can produce a temperature range of 90 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can monitor the heat of your compost pile with the use of a thermometer, similar to what you see there on the screen. But because of this heat, pathogens and weed seeds will break down. They break down at approximately 130 to 140 degrees. So this is why so many commercials use this method. However, this isn't only limited to those facilities, right? If you live in a larger residence with lots of organic material, yard waste, and you have physical space in your yard, this is the ideal method just because it can take a lot of material and it can break down a lot of things like twigs and grass clippings and stuff from your yard. Next slide, please. FBI that Dave was mentioning earlier, the fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates of the compost pile all play unique roles in the decomposition process. However, in traditional composting, we're really focusing on the strength of the bacteria of the pile. So in order to create those optimal conditions for the aerobic bacteria to thrive, we need to maintain a few parameters or ingredients of the compost pile. So greens or materials that are high in nitrogen content make up about 50% of your compost pile. Imagine items that were placed in a sealed bag for a couple days outside of your refrigerator, maybe left outside during this heat, right? When you open up that bag a little later, the material inside often looks very slimy, wet, and there's probably a very, very stinky odor coming out of that bag. It's often what happens when you're throwing away your food waste in your trash can too. You'll get that really bad smell. So things like the fruits and veggie scraps, coffee grounds and tea bags, grains, even farm animal manure would fall under this category. Just keep in mind, cat and dog feces can be toxic for your soil, so we don't want to have any harmful bacteria growing in our soil from those feces. Now, the other 50% of the compost pile is made up of browns or rich in carbon materials that are often quite dry, on the dry side, right? So untreated sawdust, dry leaves, twigs, grass clippings, cartons, or shredded paper, as long as it's not glossy or like a magazine print paper, would all fall under this category. So when you think about it, you probably already have a lot of these materials at home that you may be throwing away, but instead of throwing it away, maybe now you're going to turn these waste products into resources for your compost. And then lastly, you need to make sure that your pile has enough air and water for that aerobic bacteria to produce their energy, grow quickly, and consume that material. So that's why it's important to turn your pile and thoroughly mix your browns so that there is lots of airspace. So as the materials are consumed, the pile itself may become compressed or compacted. So you can turn your pile at minimum every 5 to 7 days to take care of this issue. But of course, you don't have to do it that often. You can do it as often as you'd like. And then the last thing you can do to make sure your compost parameters are all in order for the FBI, right? You can conduct a moisture test to your pile. So taking a handful of that compost and squeezing it in your hands, that material, when you open your hands, should remain in a ball, and it should smell quite earthy. That's when you know you'll have the optimal moisture content for your pile. So once you have all these parameters in order, you can build your hot compost pile, which we'll see here in the next slide. Thank you. So how to build and maintain your hot compost pile. There are two methods of building your pile. The first one is a lasagna or sandwich method, where you alternate about 3-inch layers of greens and browns and mixing them slightly. The other method is, so actually that first method would be more of if you had a little bit of material to start with. Now say you have a lot more yard waste and food waste material that you've been collecting over a longer period of time. The other method is more like a salad, where you're mixing everything together throughout the whole pile, about 50% browns and 50% greens. Some very important tips are to make sure that your browns within the pile are moist or dampened so that they FBI. However, as you can see in this photo here that I have, the straw or whatever other brown material you use on top should remain dry. This is to maintain moisture within the pile, but also reduce any odors of decomposing food and keep away flies. So a question I often get is, I can't get flies out of the compost pile. Most of the time, people are forgetting to put some dry browns on top. When you're turning your pile, I recommend using a pitchfork so you can fluff up your layers. You don't want to compress. And always make sure any new green material to the compost pile that it's well buried towards the center where it gets the most heat, and so that your pets and other rodents or pests do not smell that food and don't want to come to your pile. So those are just a few ways to start and maintain a compost pile. But now we'll go back to Dave to go over the requirements the city of Chula Vista has for having a compost pile in your yard.
Hey guys, before we go to that section, I wanted to remind attendees that if they wanted to ask any questions, feel free to do so throughout the presentation. And we have one question that has already come in. I'd like to ask you guys. So if you want to focus on growing native plants accustomed to the San Diego area soil types, does it make sense to amend the soil with compost?
Dave, do you want to take that, or?
Yeah, not necessarily. Native plants are adapted to the soils. However, if that soil has been left and hasn't really had, it's basically been abused. Maybe there was some development on there or something. You can amend the soil a little bit with some compost. It's just putting some an organic component in there. And if you're just putting it at 10 to 20%, it's not going to hurt it at all. And a lot of people, I mean, there's differing opinions on this. There's people that think, no, you don't need any compost for it. And then there's other people that say, well, yeah, it could use a little. So they don't really need the bacteria as much as our garden plants or vegetable gardens, but so it won't hurt.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dave.
All right. So so here's the city. We got requirements. And the main reason for that is odors. That's the biggest fear is this compost pile is going to create odors, which it has a potential for doing. So when deciding on where to put your compost bin, make sure that it's at least 6 feet away from any windows, doors, or other entrance to your neighbor's house. My house, our neighbors are really close to us, so there's only a few places where we can get that. So, and you always want to be nice to your neighbors, right? Another thing is, as far as the pile size, the compost pile size cannot be any higher than 5 feet tall, or greater than 6 feet in width or length. So they don't want those large compost piles in a residential backyard. So one way to ensure you're within the city requirements is by using either a soil saver, which is pictured here, that is available to Chula Vista residents for reduced cost of $35 after attending a workshop. Or you can use a compost tumbler bin. Next slide, please. All right, so compost tumbler is an above ground, fully contained spinning unit. And you can see there's 4 models here. There's tons of different models. This method is mainly for households with small yards and mostly food waste. The exception might be that large unit, that double unit down in the bottom left corner. Which is a nice unit because you can roll your wheelbarrow up right under it and empty it out, empty your compost into there. But so you can see all these units. It's enclosed. There's no mess, no smell, turns easy. Well, I might have overstated that a bit. There is a potential for them to leak what we call leachate out. So you probably don't want to put these on your patio or any concrete cement that you don't want to get stained. And if you put only food waste in there without browns or just pile it in there, there still is a potential for it to smell. And additionally, when you fill these up, they are not as easy to turn as when they are empty. So again, there's many different types. Some models there are several models that have dual chambers, like the one on the bottom left. The tumblers are kind of costly, anywhere from $200 to, well, the one at the bottom left, that's $650. So, and they all have varying degrees of effectiveness as far as composting. There is a tendency for them to be wet and stay wet. So I typically would leave a door open during the day just to kind of vent off some of that excess moisture. You don't want to necessarily add the more browns to it, because then your parameters are going to won't be as optimal. And of course, you got to spin this daily, actually. So if you leave it there for a couple of days in the hot sun, the tendency is for the material to clump, and then it's even harder to turn. So you always want to spin it daily. And the tendency, not only the tendency for it to be wet, as well as the size of it might not be enough to hold in that temperature. It may not reach the 130 degrees to break down those weed seeds. So how do you go about it? Same 4 parameters as what Catherine had mentioned earlier, the air, water, greens, and browns. You add the material 50-50, spin it, watch the moisture level. You may not have to wet the browns as much as you do in the other method. But yeah, and turning it will tend to dry out a little bit too. So when it's full, you want to discontinue adding material, because otherwise you will always have unfinished material in there. So you can either use a different bin if you have, or a different method if you have, or if you have a dual chamber one, you can add them in to the start filling the second chamber. So I've had a lot of people ask me, hey, so when do I put in the worms? And actually the worms are used in a different method of composting, and Catherine is going to go over that now.
So guys, we have a couple of more questions. And here's one. So during colder months, is there anything we could do to speed up the process of composting?
So during colder months, I would just recommend turning your pile. So if you're using like the soil saver bin that sits on the ground or whatever bin you're using, really just turning it to aerate that pile. Continue to add in your nitrogen products just to keep the bacteria thriving. Because even when it's cold outside, as long as the parameters are well balanced in your pile, the bacteria can still remain active, and your pile can still be quite hot, actually.
And we have another question. So this is more likely for Dave. Regarding the City of Chula Vista's size of compost bin requirement, can you have more than one compost pile as long as each pile complies with the required size?
Yes, you can, as long as oh, hold on, here it is. As long as you have, sorry, I got away from the presentation. There is another requirement. They don't want a large amounts of compost in residential, so you have to have a you have to get a permit if it's over 15 cubic yards. So
okay. And then a pretty good segue to the next section. We have another question here. Can you add worms to these tumblers, or is it too hot for them?
No, because the worms are going to get dizzy and throw up. Okay. It's in that method.
We'll answer this right now, Dave, in my little presentation.
Thank you.
And we'll come back to that question.
I'll mute myself.
All right, so we will get an answer for that question just coming up right now. So with composting with worms, or otherwise known as vermicomposting, this is a different form than the other ones we were talking about because it's a cool composting. It doesn't require turning, and it takes only food waste and some shredded paper in this system. So the worm castings you can see in the photo on the top right corner there, which is a fancy word for poop, are high nutrient form of compost. A little bit of these worm castings can be mixed into your soil or made into a tea and go a very long way. This type of compost is great to apply in your gardens throughout your growing season to naturally feed your plants as they reduce nutrients in the soil. But some things to keep in mind, I was mentioning earlier how seeds and pathogens break down at about 130 to 140 degrees. Well, in this cool form of composting, those seeds will not break down. So you may have some volunteer plants like tomatoes, for example, growing from your garden once you apply this. Now, this is really ideal for those who don't have a large space to compost or for those who perhaps live in an apartment. So you can keep this indoors on your balcony with some shade, under your sink even, in your washroom. Basically anywhere where there's shade, it's nice and cool, and it stays around 65 to 80. That's the environment that these worms like. So, for example, if your soil saver bin gets really hot, 140 degrees for a couple weeks time, and then the material starts breaking down and the temperature goes down to 80 degrees, 70 degrees, 60 degrees, then you might find worms coming up to your bin because it's cool enough for them to survive. But then once you start turning your soil saver bin again, adding more materials, and then the heat starts picking back up, then those worms would die off. The same thing for the tumbler. If it's cool in there and it stays cool, then yes, worms can thrive in there, but typically a tumbler does still produce a little bit of heat, maybe not as hot as a soil saver bin, but you're basically buying these worms and then you're going to throw away your money if your pile's getting hot and they just die. So it's better to have a separate bin for these worms. And the specific type of worm that we use in this composting method is they're called red wigglers. And we use these in composting because they have voracious appetites and they can eat up to 50% of their body weight. So these are a little bit different than the typical earthworms you'll find in your garden soil. These, you know, you're feeding them every couple days, once a week. You'll see their population start to grow and grow and grow as you feed them. So you can often start with a handful and then work your way up to thousands of worms and even make more bins to accommodate them. They will consume your vegetative food waste, but remember to feed them everything in moderation. So too much citrus, like heaps and heaps of citrus, can make them unhappy, give them tummy aches, but a little at a time is just fine. So if you have a large quantity of food scraps, say maybe you like to juice or something and you live in an apartment and you just say, hey, I can't feed my worms all this food waste at one time without getting foul odors or flies, right? So one tip that I like to tell people is you can freeze your food scraps if you have the space and then feed them out slowly to your worms, just so you don't get any bad smells or flies. Now you can purchase a fancy worm container. There's many out there on the market similar to that black tower that you see on the screen there, or you can upcycle some storage containers that you may already have at home. You can build your bin with and drill some aeration holes in there, and you can use dampened shredded paper because they like that damp environment. They breathe through their skin. You can purchase them online, or I personally go to City Farmers Nursery on Home Avenue to pick up my red wigglers and add them underneath the shredded paper. So keep them underneath. And then once they've gotten accommodated to their new home, you can introduce some food to them. Once again, always underneath that shredded paper. And then over time, as the red wigglers eat up your food waste and leave you with worm poop or castings, you can then place the food above the compost or castings that they create, and then the shredded paper still on top. So just like I was mentioning in the traditional hot composting method where you're always putting a dry layer of browns on top to keep away the flies, same thing for the vermicomposting. However, we're not turning up our bin and producing heat. So now if you're looking for an even easier method than composting with worms, let's go back to Dave and learn about this last method.
Hey guys, so I have another question on the line here.
Yeah.
And the question is, how are vermicompost and regular compost different in terms of how you use them to amend soil? Is one better than the other for certain purposes?
All right, so there is a difference. The vermicompost has a much higher nitrogen content or nutrients in general. So, you know, you don't need as much of the vermicompost to amend soil. So the regular compost can be, you know, dug into the soil to amend it or even applied over top. And then just sprinkling in some worm castings, a couple teaspoons would feed a potted plant. I would just say in the middle of a growing season, if your plant's starting to look a little sad or it's not bearing too much fruit or it's maybe taking a little bit of time, I would say adding the vermicompost to those existing plants would be better than just the regular compost alone. But Dave, if you have anything else to add to that, go for it.
Yeah, so vermicompost typically has a higher nutrient level than the the hot composting or traditional composting. And so Catherine was right as far as the amount needed. It's not necessarily you won't need as much. And that just depends on what you're using it for too. If you're using it for, and actually we'll go into this a little later, but if you're using it for a new planting or a vegetable garden, then you probably want to use quite a bit of it. But and if I don't answer that question in upcoming, then please, John, feel free to ask additional questions. So and I see we have another question, and I'll just get to that hopefully answer that in a little bit. But right now I'm going to go over what I call composting for the less motivated. So all households can use this method. You don't need any browns. You don't need to turn it at all. It's an easier way of, or a less active way of composting. And it's basically filling up a bucket with your vegetative food waste and just leaving it there. It's based on a method called post-hole composting, or sometimes it's referred to as a dig and drop method. You can see in the photo on the left-hand side, it's you dig a hole about a foot and a half deep, throw your food waste in there, and then cover it up and make sure you have at least 6 to 8 inches of soil above that food waste that you put in there. On the top right of the screen, you can see there is a type of composter, a type of unit that is sold that does this. There are a couple different ones. That one's called a solar tube, and it works pretty good. It just you don't want to fill that whole thing up. It has like this laundry basket down below it that you're opening the lid, throwing the food in there, and then letting it be. And so you see the bucket that's in my backyard, and that's the method. The organisms are going to come up through the ground, the worms and other bacteria and stuff, break that material down, and then you are able to scoop it out. Thank you for that. So as far as smells, you're putting vegetative food waste in there. It's going to rot. So anytime you open up the lid, it's going to smell a little, unless it's been a while since it's been opened up. So how this is done is you take a 5-gallon bucket, you drill holes. They could be anywhere from 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch. You drill them into the sides in the bottom of that bucket. You dig a bucket size hole, put the bucket in that hole, fill it in around the edge of the sides of the bucket, and put the lid on. And then as you have your food waste, you open the lid, throw it in there, and then cover it up. You can see in that on the bottom right side that I've since replaced the original lid with a plant pot, a clay plant pot dish, that because it's out in the sun and the original one breaks down, the plastic breaks down in the sun really quick. And then that kind of keeps those keeps the moisture in, a little weighted, so it keeps the animals out. You can see that one broke, so now I have to put a brick on there. But you can see that look at the compost. The compost looks really good, and it's been a while since I've added it because I used to collect all the material from the office and haven't been there in a while. So, but you can see after a couple months, it's just sitting there. It dried out a little, but I can just incorporate that into the soil. So speaking of which, you can see I have a toothbrush in there, a bamboo toothbrush, and some eggshells, and there's some also nutshells too in there that don't really break down in this method that well. So how do I know when this compost is ready, is finished? So Catherine's here to tell us a little bit more of that.
Hey guys, can we do one more question on worms?
Oh, yes.
So speaking of how warm it's been lately, so how cool does it have to be to sustain worms?
So the worms are happy at about 65, 80, maybe even 85-degree temperature range. So it's probably, I would say, more difficult to start a completely new bin in the middle of summer when it's very hot. Of course, you can bring it indoors into a more controlled environment, so it's a little cooler, or maybe you have a large tree in your backyard that you can place a bin where it gets constant shade. However, once you have an existing vermicompost bin, the castings that they create, kind of keep a cool environment as it is underneath that soil. So if you have an existing bin in the summer, just keep it out of the sun, bring it indoors if you need to, and just don't dig in there too much, I would say. Kind of leave it untouched and just kind of add the food underneath the shredded paper. But if you are starting your worm bin in the middle of summer, yeah, you're definitely going to need to keep it indoors where it can stay cooler, so you don't risk losing your money on your worms.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I saw the question above that, Will, about adding compost to your garden. We'll actually answer that in just a few more slides. But before I get into my section, I'm just curious. Let's do a poll question for the audience. Which method of composting are you most interested in trying? Is it the hot traditional compost method? Is it maybe the vermicomposting using the tumblers, or maybe the less motivated bucket or post-hole composting? Just a few seconds there if you can answer that for us. All right, let's see how we did here. Okay, so we have 4 for traditional and 4 for the less motivated composting. I like that, about 50-50 there. And 2 for vermicomposting and 3 for tumblers. Interesting. Well,
Do
if
we
you're
want to go? Sorry, do we
Yeah.
want to go to the question I missed there? So, how much compost do you add to your garden if you wanna?
Yeah.
If you like to add to your plant?
We're
while
gonna
your
actually
plants grow?
answer that, Manuel, in the next set of Dave's
Oh,
slides.
perfect. Thank you.
So yeah, they'll be answered very shortly. All right. So let's see. How do you know when compost is finished, right? Very, very dark in color, kind of like chocolate cake. It smells like earthy soil and not like decomposing food scraps anymore. And the materials are very indistinguishable from one another. That's when you'll know, hey, this compost is almost ready to use in my garden. Another indicator of finished compost is if you are monitoring the temperature of your compost pile, especially with like a thermometer, you'll notice that the pile stays very cool, like in the 70s, 60s, 50-degree range. And no matter how much you're turning your pile or adding new ingredients, it's not really getting that much hotter than that temperature range. Then it's like, hey, that's a good indicator that I probably have some finished compost that I can screen out. I often notice when I'm turning piles at the Living Coast, if I'm trying to pick up a big clump with my pitchfork, and before I even make it over back into the other bin, half of the material has already fallen through. I'll also want to pull out my screen and start breaking down or start sifting the material. So because not all materials break down at the same rate, as you start composting, you'll notice that the browns take a little bit longer than the greens to break down. It's important that you screen your compost, especially if you're not willing to wait for your whole pile to break down uniformly. So from the tumblers to the soil savers, if you were very, very patient and could wait 6 months or more for some finished compost for your whole pile, then you can forgo the screening process. But if you need your compost a little bit more quickly, or you need to continually add to a pile, you can out whatever's finished, and then any big chunks that are left over that stay on top of your screen can be thrown back into your compost to continue the process. It's also important to let your compost cure for a week or two before applying it to your garden. Make sure that all the materials are fully decomposed and will not heat back up in your soil when you apply it. So one method of using compost is to make a compost tea. A little bit of this can go a long way in your garden. So if you're just starting your vermicompost bin, you don't have too much, but you see your vegetable plants are looking a little unhappy, and that's the best way to use your vermicompost is through a tea. It also acts as a natural insect repellent. And you can apply it directly onto the foliage. So to make this compost tea, you'll take a bucket of dechlorinated water. You can just fill it up with the bucket with your hose and let that sit for a day to dechlorinate. You want to collect 2 to 3 cups of your compost or worm castings and make a tea bag. I've used a cheesecloth. I've even used my old pantyhose to make a tea bag, basically any mesh that you have. Submerge that tea bag into the water and place an air pump with air stone into the water. So we need to make sure that there is oxygen in this bucket. We don't want to brew any anaerobic bacteria that can harm our plants. So you let it brew for a day or two and stir it occasionally. And when you're ready, you can dilute your tea 1-to-1 ratio and apply it to your plants within 24 to 48 hours. So you can see in the picture above, the plants on the right received a tea, and you can just see that they're much taller, their leaf span's much broader, and they just generally look a little bit more happy than the other side. And if you're running into pest problems, you can do multiple sprays every few days or maybe once a week, brew a small batch, and then apply to your plants. And that should take care of any pest problems. Like Dave was saying earlier, it's very, very important that if you do have pest issues, instead of first thing you go to is taking a pesticide and spraying down your plant, or it's looking droopy and you're just spraying in an inorganic fertilizer, think about improving the soil and see if that will take care of your problems. And even using just a gentle soapy water instead of a pesticide would be better to get rid of pests. But that's just one way to use your compost. Dave's going to show you the other ways to apply your compost in the garden, and we'll answer that one question we had about how much compost to add.
Thank you, Catherine.
You're welcome.
Next slide, please. So the compost tea is a good way of, if your plants are yellowing or they need something, that's a good way, if you water them with the compost tea, to get them that pretty quick nutrient level. So by adding compost into the soil, you are adding those nutrients, but you're also building the soil. So it's not going to be immediate. And because the compost doesn't give out a lot of nitrogen at once, and that's part of the goodness of it. So as far as the compost application, if you're doing a new garden or a vegetable garden, again, you are preparing this garden, this plot for the plants. So you want to improve the soil as part of that. And so ideally, it's about 20 to 30% that you're going to have. You don't want 100% compost. It does need some of that. The plants do need that inorganic component. So if you're adding 2 to 3 inches of compost and dig it into the top 6 to 8, 10 inches, that is you're doing good. If it's a brand new garden, you might want to add just a little more than that, maybe 40%. But once that compost gets into the soil, it'll start. It'll help to improve that soil. So as far as an established garden, if you have established plants, large plants, you can't really dig it in to the soil because of the roots. So you can use it apply it more as a mulch, and that can be anywhere from 2 to 6 inches. You don't want to put it up against the trunk of the plant, but using it as a mulch again will help to help keep that soil, the moisture content of that soil up, as well as insulate it from any heat. And then also the nutrients, the bugs and the organisms who are going to come up, grab it and bring it down, and you will soon see your soil improve. So I think hopefully I've answered that question. I think we have another poll question coming up. Do you know the difference between compost and mulch? And you got 10 seconds left to answer that. How do I get the question? Oh, there it is. All right.
So
Okay.
hey, David Catter, we have it looks like it might be a statement, perhaps a question, but this is a good chance for either of you guys to address it. So the statement here says you can only use vermicompost to make tea. Is this yes or no?
No, you can use regular compost to make tea. However, the vermicompost is just much higher in nutrients than the other type of compost. So you would need more cups of compost to make your tea than with the vermicompost. Hopefully that's clear. Yeah.
And then there's another question. Sorry, go ahead.
You can add the vermicompost directly into the soil too.
Yeah,
what I'll do is I'll take the mulch up, my fruit trees, I'll take the mulch away and put the vermicompost under and then bring the mulch back.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another question here. For years, I've been filling up my green waste bin at home for weekly pickup by Republic Services. Where does this material go and what's being done with it?
So that is going to the Otay landfill. They have a composting operations. It is chipped and ground and then put into, it's either put into our composting operations, I forget the name of it. It's getting composted, or it goes and is used for a mulch. It's screened and used for a mulch. Sometimes it's used as alternative daily cover, and sometimes it's used along the outside of the landfill for erosion protection.
And I understand that it's also marketed to folks that engineer soils for different applications, right?
Yes, it goes to, some of it goes to Plant's Choice, which they create different blends for their customers.
Okay. And we have another question. How much compost is good for raised beds?
20 to 30% would be the same for that. So depending on, if you have 10 inches of raised beds, then, you add 2 to 3 or 1 to 2 inches. Yeah, 2 to 3 inches.
And then the last question here is going to be answered in part of this presentation about whether the city provides mulch or compost for schools or residences. Go ahead.
Oh, back to me. Next slide, please. So coming up actually, I guess I'll answer that question. What is the difference between compost and mulch? Mulch is anything that covers the soil. So that could be an organic component would be wood chips, compost, decorative bark, leaves, straw. Any of that will be an organic mulch, and you can put those in different thicknesses as well. An inorganic mulch would be a gravel, big rocks, even plastic sheeting would be considered as a mulch. So that is the difference, and the mulch, the benefits of mulch are the higher moisture retention of the soil, insulation. It helps, kind of creates a barrier for weeds. However, there's always weeds blowing, and so there could be some seeds that get into that mulch and start growing, but you can pull them out pretty easily. So the next slide, please. So for Chula Vista residents who are interested in getting larger quantities of compost within this week, we have this Saturday, we have a free compost event for Chula Vista residents. It's 8 to noon at the Otay landfill. You can bring your containers, whether you bring bags, 5-gallon buckets, garbage cans, or you bring your truck. You can come up and load that up. Bring a shovel too. Load that up. Bring your masks as well, please, and take it home for you. We have that 3 times a year. It's March, August, and November. You can see those dates on our calendar, on the city's calendar. And hopefully I've answered all the questions. We never run out, so don't worry about not being able to get it. All right, so next announcement, Catherine?
Yes, next slide, please. So just to reiterate, Chula Vista residents can get that Soil Saver bin for $35 by attending one of my workshops. So you can find the link here for Zoom, first and third Sunday of every month at 2 p.m. I'll be holding these virtual workshops until we're able to open to the public. And even then, I might consider doing a once a month virtual workshop for those who'd like to stay at home. And then if you're a teacher who needs some resources in the classroom, maybe, or you just need more information on a certain topic, I've made a pre-recorded 6-part workshop series where I go into very detailed explanation of the different methods, how to build it from scratch. You watch me do that. I turn it for you on camera so we can do some troubleshooting together and stuff like that. You can find those on our Facebook and YouTube Living Coast Discovery Center playlists. But on our last slide, if it's easier to just email me, Catherine@thelivingcoast.org, for any more information on these workshops, feel free. Just make sure you get my spelling right.
Well, thank you very much, David and Catherine. Wonderful presentation. Thank you for everybody online. Again, please join us. First, let me ask if there's any other questions. We're a little bit over time, but it's fine. I think we could stand on for a little bit more. If not, yeah, we have another question. Sorry. So if I have 3 big water, I want to use a raised, let's see if I can read this correctly. I want to raise beds. Can I go Saturday to get compost, but will I need to mix it with regular potting soil? So if she's going to go on Saturday to get compost, does she need to mix it with potting soil?
So yes, you can mix it with potting soil. That potting soil will already have probably a little organic component in there. But you can, if you can dig dirt from your backyard and fill it in and then mix it in with that new compost, you can do that as well.
Great. So, and then one tip we forgot to mention was for those for pickup trucks picking up compost, make sure you take a tarp to tarp your compost. Otherwise, when you get home, it might all be gone. Might all be flown away.
Oh no.
Yeah. So, well, thank you again. As you can see on the screen there, we have 3 more wonderful webinars or presentations coming in September, going electric in Chula Vista. That sounds really exciting if you're into electric cars. And then food waste solutions for your home and everyday life. That's going to be a presentation by the San Diego Food Systems Alliance. Wonderful information that's going to be presented. And then lastly, you'll see there on September 24th with sustainability at the library. Really, a really cool program. We're going to be showcasing where you could borrow tools to check how your home is performing when it comes to making sure you're energy efficient. So thank you very much again for joining us. Join us for the next upcoming webinars, and you have a good rest of your day and afternoon. Thank you. Evening, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.